The cold mud seeped into my silk dress, a bitter reminder that everything I thought was solid had just dissolved into filth. "I never loved you, Elara." Julian's voice cut through the rhythmic drumming of the rain, sharper than any blade. "You were a chore. A box I had to tick to get to the finish line. But look at you now, broken, pathetic, and officially penniless." As he pushed me away, my heels skidded on the wet pavement and I collapsed, the sting of the gravel against my palms barely registering compared to the hollow ache in my chest. I looked up, blinking away tears and rain, to see my stepsister Chloe leaning against Julian's chest. She wasn't just taking my fiancé. She was wearing my mother's vintage pearls, the ones my father had stolen from my jewelry box only a week ago. Her smile was a jagged thing, fueled by years of resentment. "Did you really think a girl like you deserved a happy ending?" she mocked, her voice thin and cruel. Dad was right. You're just a placeholder for the real heiress. In that moment, as they turned their backs on me to walk toward the warm glow of the mansion I used to call home, I realized that I wasn't just losing a man. I was losing my mother's legacy, my dignity, and the very ground I stood on. To understand how I ended up face down in the dirt outside my own gates, you have to understand the woman my mother was. Elara Sterling was a force of nature visionary who built Sterling Dynamics from a garage startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire. She was all grace and steel, a woman who taught me that a name means nothing if you don't have the spine to carry it. But her one fatal flaw was her heart. She loved my father Arthur with a blind devotion that he never deserved. When the cancer took her 3 years ago, the light in our home didn't just dim, it was snuffed out. Within 6 months, Arthur had moved Isabel and her daughter, Chloe, into our house. It was as if he had a second family waiting in the wings, a real life that my mother and I were merely funding. I became a ghost in my own home. I watched as Isabel replaced my mother's paintings with garish modern art, and I felt the coldness in my father's eyes every time I walked into a room. I wasn't his daughter. I was an obstacle between him and the total control of the Sterling fortune. The will was my mother's final attempt at protection, or perhaps her final mistake. She knew Arthur was a spendthrift and a social climber. She left the controlling interest of the company and the entirety of the estate to me, but with a clause that felt like a noose. "To my beloved daughter, Elara, you shall inherit the full weight of the Sterling legacy upon the day of your legal marriage, provided said marriage occurs before your 25th birthday. Should you remain unwed, or should the marriage be dissolved within the first year without cause, the entirety of the estate shall revert to your father, Arthur Sterling, to manage as he sees fit." My 25th birthday was only 2 weeks away. I had been with Julian for 2 years. He was the son of a business associate, a man of good standing who seemed to adore me. I thought he was my escape, my partner, the person who would help me reclaim my mother's chair at the boardroom table. We were supposed to go to the courthouse in 3 days. I had spent months pouring my heart and my secrets into him. I told him how much I missed my mother. I told him how my father had been slowly draining the company's auxiliary accounts. I trusted him with my life. I didn't know that every word I spoke was being fed back to Isabel and Chloe. I didn't know that my loving fiancé was spending his nights in my stepsister's bed, laughing at my grief and planning the exact moment they would break me. They waited until the very last moment, until I was most vulnerable, to reveal the truth. They wanted to ensure there was no time for me to find someone else. If I couldn't marry by my birthday, the company, my mother's life's work, would fall into the hands of the man who had already replaced her in his heart. As I sat there in the rain, the iron gates of the estate hissed shut, locking me out. I was Elara Sterling, the girl who had everything, and yet I had nothing but the wet clothes on my back and a heart that felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. The betrayal was so absolute it felt physical, a crushing pressure in my lungs. I looked at the dark road ahead, wondering if this was where the story ended, with me disappearing into the shadows, while they celebrated their victory with my mother's champagne. But then a shadow moved. The shadow detached itself from the weeping willow near the edge of the estate. At first I flinched, pulling my knees to my chest, expecting another one of my father's hired guards to chase me off the sidewalk. But the man who stepped into the amber glow of the street lamp didn't look like a guard. He looked like a ghost of the city. His coat was a patchwork of grime and faded wool. His hair a matted tangle, and a thick, unkempt beard hid most of his face. He smelled of wood smoke and the cold, damp earth.
Julian hadn't gone inside yet. He saw the man and let out a sharp, ugly laugh. Look at that, Elara. Your new social circle has arrived to welcome you. Maybe he has a spare cardboard box for you to sleep in. Julian stepped toward me, his hand raised as if to physically shove me further into the gutter, but the stranger moved with a speed that defied his ragged appearance. Before Julian's hand could touch my shoulder, the man's hand calloused and stained with grease clamped around Julian's wrist like a vice.
"The lady is leaving," the stranger said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air between us. It wasn't the voice of a broken man. It was the voice of a command. Julian tried to jerk away, his face flushing crimson. "Get your filthy hands off me, you piece of trash." "Do you have any idea who I am?" The stranger didn't blink. He simply increased the pressure until Julian gasped, his knees buckling slightly. "I know exactly what you are," the man whispered. With a single fluid motion, he shoved Julian back toward the gates. "Go back to your stolen house before I decide to keep that hand as a souvenir." Chloe screamed from the porch, calling for the dogs, and Julian scrambled back inside, his bravado shattered. I stayed on the ground, trembling, the rain finally soaking through to my skin. The stranger turned to me. He didn't reach out to touch me, sensing my fear. He simply stood there, an immovable wall against the storm. When I finally looked up, I saw his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a predator or a victim. They were deep, clear, and filled with an ancient, weary kind of kindness, the eyes of someone who had seen the bottom of the world and survived it. "Why did you help me?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted by wolves in expensive suits," he replied. A frantic, desperate idea began to bloom in the wreckage of my mind. My birthday was days away. My father and Julian thought they had backed me into a corner where I would have to beg for a crumb of my own inheritance. They thought no respectable man would touch me now that my reputation was being shredded by their lies. But the will didn't ask for respectability. It asked for a husband. I stood up, wiping the mud from my face with the back of my hand. I looked at this man, this nameless, homeless protector who had nothing to gain from me. "I don't even know your name," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Silas," he said shortly. "Silas, I have a proposal. It's insane and it might be dangerous, and I can't offer you love. But I can offer you a roof, a bed, and a chance to burn down the world that tried to crush us both." I took a step closer, the cold wind whipping my hair. "Marry me tomorrow, at the courthouse, just for a year. I'll take care of everything. You'll never have to sleep in the cold again." He stared at me for a long beat, his gaze searching mine as if looking for a hidden trap. Then a slow, grim smile touched his lips beneath that beard. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most desperate. Either way, I've always liked a good fight." We spent that night in the back of my old, beat-up SUV, the only thing I still technically owned. The next morning, we stood in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of the county courthouse. I had bought him a cheap, oversized flannel shirt and a pair of jeans from a 24-hour supermarket. He had washed his face in a gas station sink, but he still looked like a man the world had forgotten. I, in my stained silk dress and smeared eyeliner, looked like a woman the world was trying to destroy. When the clerk asked for the rings, I pulled a simple silver band from my thumb, my mother's work ring, and Silas produced a piece of copper wire he had twisted into a circle during the wait. "I pronounce you husband and wife," the clerk mumbled, not even looking up. It was done. I was Elara Sterling Vane. I didn't even know his last name until he signed the papers, Silas Vane. But as we walked out of that courthouse, the victory felt hollow. I checked my phone to find 30 missed calls from my father and a legal notification. My father wasn't waiting for the deadline. He had filed an emergency injunction to freeze the Sterling Dynamics voting shares, claiming I was mentally unstable and consorting with vagrants to circumvent the spirit of the will. He wasn't just trying to take the company. He was trying to have me declared incompetent so he could control my life forever. I looked at Silas, standing there in his oversized clothes, looking every bit the vagrant my father described. I had a husband, yes. But I had no money, no home, and the most powerful lawyers in the city were currently sharpening their knives for my throat. I had brought a man with nothing into a war where I was already losing everything. We didn't go to a palace. We went to a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the industrial district, the only asset my mother had kept in her personal name. Separate from the estate, a small sanctuary she'd bought for her old nurse. It was dusty, smelling of lemon polish and forgotten years, but it was ours. I'm sorry, I said, leaning against the peeling wallpaper of the tiny kitchen. I promised I'd take care of you, and I've brought you to a hole in the wall. Silas didn't look disappointed. He walked to the window, his broad shoulders blocking out the meager light. It has a door that locks, Elara. That's more than I've had in a long time. I spent the afternoon scrubbing the grime of the streets off myself, and then I turned to him. I bought a basic grooming kit and some decent clothes with the last few $100s in my emergency cash stash. Let me, I whispered, gesturing to his wild beard. He sat on a wooden chair, perfectly still, as I trimmed away the matted hair. As the layers of vagrant fell away, a face began to emerge that made my breath hitch. He had a jawline like carved granite and a mouth that looked like it hadn't smiled in a decade. When I was done, he didn't look like a beggar. He looked like a fallen king. There, I said, my fingers lingering near his temple. Now they won't be able to say I married a ghost. But my father was 10 steps ahead. The next morning, I tried to enter the Sterling Dynamics headquarters. The security guard, a man I'd known since I was 6, wouldn't even look me in the eye. Orders from Mr. Sterling, Miss Elara. You're barred from the premises pending the competency hearing. Competency hearing? I felt the blood drain from my face. Behind him, the glass elevators hissed open. My father, Arthur, stepped out, flanked by a team of lawyers in charcoal suits. He looked at me and then at Silas with a disgust so thick it was almost tangible. You really did it, didn't you? Arthur said, his voice smooth and cold. You dragged a man off the sidewalk to spit on your mother's memory. Do you think a judge will see this as a legal marriage? It's a desperate stunt by a girl who's lost her mind. The will said I had to be married, Father, I snapped, standing my ground. It didn't specify his net worth. No, Arthur smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth. But the Sterling bylaws state that any transfer of voting power must be to a stable household. I've already filed for temporary guardianship over you. Elara, since your husband has no social security record, no bank account, and no history before 3 years ago, the law views him as a non-entity. He's not a husband. He's a prop. He stepped closer, leaning in so only I could hear him. I'm liquidating the company, Elara. I'm selling the Sterling patents to our biggest rival tomorrow morning. By the time your court date comes around, there will be nothing left for you to inherit but the debt. I felt the world tilt. My mother's life's work sold to the very people who had tried to bankrupt her for 20 years. I looked at Silas, expecting him to be cowed by the power in the room. But he was looking at the lead lawyer's briefcase, his eyes narrowed, his posture strangely relaxed, as if he were watching a movie he'd already seen. We were forced to leave, mocked by the laughter of the men in the lobby. Back at the apartment, I collapsed into a chair, the weight of the defeat finally breaking me. It's over, I sobbed. He's going to burn it all down just so I can't have it. I can't prove who you are, Silas. I don't even know who you are. Silas walked over and knelt in front of me. He took my hands and his grip was steady, grounding. You told me you wanted to burn down the world that tried to crush us, he said softly. I can't fight a ghost, Silas. I have no evidence, no money, and no allies. You have a husband, he said. He stood up and walked to the corner of the room where he'd left his old tattered coat. He reached into a hidden lining and pulled out a small obsidian black burner phone. It looked incredibly expensive, a stark contrast to his flannel shirt. He dialed a number, his voice shifting into something cold, precise, and terrifyingly authoritative. This is Vane, he said into the receiver. Initiate a scorched earth protocol on the Sterling Dynamics acquisition. Block the patent transfer. And find out which Judge Arthur Sterling is paying off. I want a full audit of his offshore accounts by midnight. He hung up and looked at me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes that wasn't just kindness. It was power. Pure, unadulterated power. Who are you? I whispered, a chill running down my spine. I'm the man you saved from the rain, he said. But before that, I was the man who owned the bank that holds your father's debt, and Elara? I'm very protective of my wife's interests. Suddenly, there was a heavy thundering at the door. Not a knock, a demand. I peered through the peephole to see 3 men in black tactical gear. They weren't police. They weren't my father's guards. They found me, Silas muttered, his face turning pale. Elara, get in the bathroom. Lock the door. Do not come out until you hear me say your mother's name. Silas, what's happening? The reason I was on the street wasn't because I was poor, he said, pushing me toward the back of the apartment as the door began to splinter. It was because I was dead. And if they see you with me, they'll make sure you are too. The door burst open with a deafening crash. I expected Silas to cower. Instead, I watched the man I'd married, the man who had been sleeping on a park bench 48 hours ago, transform. He didn't just fight, he dismantled them. He moved with a brutal, terrifying precision, using the cramped space of the kitchen to his advantage. A chair became a shield, a kitchen knife a blur of silver. The air was filled with the sickening thud of bone against bone and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. Where is the drive vein? One of the men gasped, pinned against the wall by Silas's forearm. The board wants their ghosts back in the ground. Tell the board, Silas growled, his voice dropping an octave into something primal, that the ghost has found a reason to haunt them. Suddenly, the hallway outside erupted with more noise. Police! Nobody move! I pushed the bathroom door open, gasping for air, just as my father Arthur stepped over the wreckage of our front door. He wasn't alone. He had brought 2 police officers, his lead counsel, and to my absolute horror, a local news crew he clearly tipped off to document my shameful life. There! Arthur shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the scene. Do you see? My daughter is consorting with international criminals. She's living in a den of violence. Officers, arrest that man immediately. He's kidnapped my daughter and is clearly part of a gang. The police moved in, guns drawn, as Silas stood over the unconscious bodies of the 3 intruders. Silas didn't resist. He slowly raised his hands, his eyes locked on mine, a silent apology written in the depths of those clear, piercing irises. Look at him. Julian's voice rang out from behind the cameras. He stepped into the room looking polished and smug. Elara, you really picked a winner. A homeless hitman? You finally lost it. The Sterling name is officially dead, and so is your claim to the throne. My father stepped forward, a legal document in his hand. As your guardian, I'm signing the commitment papers tonight. Elara, you're going to a private facility until you're well. And as for your husband, he'll rot in a cell for the rest of his miserable life. The cameras were rolling, the red light of the lens capturing every second of my humiliation. My father reached out to grab my arm, his face twisted in a mask of greedy triumph. It's over, Elara. Give me the Sterling Dynamics seal, now. I looked at Silas. He was being pushed against the wall by the officers, his face pressed against the peeling wallpaper. But he wasn't looking at the police. He was looking at a man standing at the very back of the crowd, a man in a tailored Italian suit who had just stepped into the room. Actually, the man in the suit said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a gunshot, Mr. Sterling, you might want to put that pen down. The room went silent. Even the cameraman paused. And who the hell are you? Arthur barked, his face turning a blotchy purple. I am the chief legal officer for Vane International, the man replied, stepping forward and handing a thick folder to the police officers. And you are currently trespassing on the private property of my CEO. Furthermore, you are attempting to assault the wife of the man who, as of 10 minutes ago, has purchased 51% of your outstanding debt and 30% of your company's voting shares. The officer looking at the folder went pale. He immediately stepped back from Silas, holstering his weapon. Sir, we had no idea. Silas stood up straight, brushing the dust from his shoulders. The beggar was gone. In his place stood a man so commanding, so inherently powerful that the entire room seemed to shrink. He walked toward my father, each step echoing in the silence. You wanted to sell the Sterling patents, Arthur? Silas asked, his voice a low, dangerous purr. I bought them. You wanted to declare your daughter incompetent? I've already submitted the video evidence of your embezzlement to the district attorney. And you? He turned his gaze to Julian, who was trying to hide behind the news crew. I'd start running. I'm a very vengeful husband. My father's face went from purple to a ghostly, translucent white. He looked at the cameras, the very cameras he had brought to destroy me, and realized he had just broadcasted his own downfall to the entire city. Elara, my father whispered, his voice cracking. I was only trying to protect the legacy. I took a step toward him, my heart cold. No, father, you were trying to kill it. But you forgot one thing. My mother didn't just leave me a company. She left me her spine. I looked at Silas. He was standing there, the most powerful man I'd ever met, waiting for my word. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it would explode. Everything, my life, the company, the future, hung on the next 10 seconds. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the frantic clicking of the news cameras. My father looked at the lens, then at Silas, then at me. His knees finally gave out and he slumped into the very chair he had tried to evict me from. The police didn't wait for a confession. The files Silas's lawyer provided were enough to lead him and Julian out in handcuffs, their faces shielded from the very reporters they had invited to my downfall. Chloe stood in the corner, her expensive pearls clattering to the floor as she realized that the real heiress was now just the daughter of a disgraced criminal. A week later, I stood in my mother's old office on the top floor of Sterling Dynamics. The mahogany desk felt cold, but the air was finally clear. The merger with Vane International was official not as a takeover, but as a partnership that made us the most powerful entity in the industry. Silas was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. He wore a suit now that cost more than my father's entire car collection, his beard trimmed to a sharp, elegant line. He looked every bit the shark the business world feared, but when he turned to me, his eyes still held that same weary kindness I'd seen in the rain. "You knew?" I whispered, holding a file I had found in my mother's private safe. "You didn't just happen to be outside my gates that night." Silas walked toward me, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He took the file from my hand. Inside was a photo from 20 years ago, my mother, young and radiant, standing next to a lean, hungry-looking man in a cheap suit. "I wasn't always a billionaire, Elara," Silas said softly. 20 years ago, I was a kid with a brilliant idea and zero capital. Every door in the city slammed in my face. Your mother was the only one who opened hers. She gave me my first $1 million. She told me that one day the world would try to break me, and I'd need to remember who I was." He looked out at the horizon. "When my board tried to stage a coup and frame me for fraud 6 months ago, I had to disappear. I had to become a ghost to find out who was leaking my secrets. I lived on the streets because it was the only place no one looked for a king. I was planning my return for months. But then I saw you. I saw Evelyn's daughter being treated the way the world once treated me. So the marriage, it was just a debt you were paying back." My heart sank, a familiar ache returning. Silas stepped into my space, taking my face in his hands. His palms were no longer stained with grease, but they were still warm. "The marriage started as a debt, Elara. I thought it was just protecting an investment. But that night in the apartment, when you offered me your last few $100s and washed the dirt off my face, you didn't see a billionaire. You didn't even see a stable husband. You saw a human being." He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "I spent my whole life building an empire so I would never be vulnerable again. But I'd trade every cent of Vane International just to have you look at me like that one more time." The year-long contract we had signed at the courthouse sat on the desk between us. I picked it up, feeling the weight of the paper. Without a word, I tore it down the middle, then again and again, until the pieces fell like snow into the wastebasket. "The contract is gone," I said, my voice steady for the first time in years. "If you stay, it's because you want to." Silas didn't say a word. He simply pulled me into a kiss that tasted like rain, salt, and a future I finally owned. My father is currently serving 10 years for corporate fraud and embezzlement. Chloe and Isabel were left with nothing but the clothes they wore the day they were evicted from the mansion. People ask me all the time how I turned it all around, how I saved a dying company and married the most elusive bachelor in the world. I just tell them the truth. Sometimes you have to lose everything to realize that the person standing in the gutter might be the only one who can show you the stars. My mother's legacy isn't just a name or a building. It was the knowledge that true power isn't in what you own, but in who you choose to stand by when the storm hits. And as for Silas, he still keeps that twisted copper wire ring in a velvet box on his nightstand. He says it's to remind him that the best thing he ever bought didn't cost him a single penny.